The plasma bottle rocketed across the bar, exploded in a flash of blue fire, and set one of the Brar warriors' beards ablaze. His screams echoed through the room, but the old bartender didn't even flinch. He just wiped a glass, calmly muttered something about amateur hour, and reached under the counter with the same hand that once detonated a tactical nuke with a spoon. The bar doors slammed shut with a deafening hiss. Steel slammed. Lights dimmed. And the smell of singed alien fur mixed with a quiet sense of dread. The warrior howled, clawing at his flaming beard, while his 6 brothers looked around, confused. The old man finally looked up. His voice was slow. Final. You boys ever been in a real bar fight? That was the moment everyone realized. This wasn't just a bar, and this bartender wasn't just some harmless relic serving overpriced whiskey. The Rusty Comet had always been a strange place. Orbiting a half-dead moon on the edge of the Delos Belt, the bar served as a last stop for interstellar truckers, pirate scum, retired bounty hunters, and the occasional fugitive with enough credits to pretend they were just passing through. It wasn't much to look at: flickering neon sign, cracked windows patched with hull tape, and a smell that suggested someone had once tried to deep-fry a starfish. But it was neutral ground. That was the rule. No violence. No politics. No war. Just drinks, cards, and the occasional brawl that didn't break too many bones. The only reason that rule held up was the man behind the bar. Everyone called him Old Joe. He had a permanent squint, hands like gnarled tree roots, and a way of moving that suggested he didn't rush for anything, not even death. He didn't smile. Didn't talk unless he had to. Just poured drinks with terrifying precision, and cleaned the bar with a stained rag that might have predated the Terran Alliance. No one knew his past, and most were too afraid to ask. Some said he was a deserter. Others whispered about old wars and secret kills. But to the regulars, Joe was just part of the furniture, solid, unmovable, and oddly comforting. That changed the moment the Brar clan walked in. They were enormous. Hulking. A species bred for war, with tusks like bone knives and voices that made chandeliers rattle. They swaggered in like they owned the place, stomping on tables, shoving chairs aside, laughing like war drums in the fog. One of them threw a plasma axe at the jukebox and shouted something about real music, then laughed when it exploded. Another picked up a regular, some skinny mechanic named Drix, and spun him in the air before tossing him out the door like a used rag. Nobody moved. Not because they didn't care, but because they were watching Joe. He said nothing. That's when the mocking started. Loud. Crude. Relentless. You call this a bartender? One of them roared. This hairless prune look like he can barely lift a shot glass. Another slammed his fists on the bar. Hey, fossil! Got anything stronger than that dishwater you call whiskey? Joe didn't blink. Just poured a drink, slid it across the counter, and waited. The warrior downed it, and immediately collapsed to the floor, twitching. The others roared with laughter, thinking it was some kind of joke. Joe calmly poured another. Next? He asked. There was something about his voice. It wasn't loud, but it had weight. Like a whisper inside a coffin. The Brovars didn't notice. Or didn't care. They kept drinking, kept throwing things, kept roaring and dancing and banging on tables. One even pissed in a corner. That's when the clock hit midnight. There was a subtle click under the bar. The air changed. Lights dimmed. A steel curtain dropped over the windows, sealing the place in. The laughter started to die down, one warrior at a time, as they began to realize they were locked in. What's this? One growled, reaching for his blade. Some kind of joke? Joe finally looked up, his eyes catching the light in a way that made the room feel colder. Not a joke, he said. Happy hour's over. Lady Vex had been watching from the corner booth, her hood pulled low over her cybernetically enhanced eyes. She was dressed like a drifter, but her fingers never stopped moving, flicking across a device hidden in her lap. When the doors sealed, she smiled. Not because she was in on it, but because she'd suspected for weeks that this old man was more than he seemed. She leaned forward now, whispering under her breath. Oh, they're so screwed. The biggest of the Brovars, a beast called Corga, growled and drew a double-headed war club from his back. Open the damn doors, old man, he said, stepping forward. Joe raised a brow, took a sip from his own glass, and pressed another button under the counter. Instantly, the floor tiles shimmered, and the entire room shifted. The stools retracted. The pool table rose up, humming. The lights above buzzed, then shot out thin red beams that began to scan the warriors like surgical lasers. One of them flinched, raised his club, and was immediately shot across the room by a hidden spring-loaded cannon embedded in the liquor shelf. The bar had turned into a battlefield. And Joe? He was in his element. He moved like a man 50 years younger, flipping bottles that exploded in perfect arcs, ducking under projectiles like he'd choreographed the chaos. Another warrior charged him and got tripped by a stool with retractable legs. He face-planted into the counter, which immediately sealed shut and magnetized, trapping him there. A third tried to use a shock blade, but the lights above him surged, frying the blade and zapping him unconscious. Joe didn't break a sweat. It wasn't just violence. It was poetry. Brutal, ridiculous poetry. Every move Joe made was efficient, quiet, and impossibly effective. And all around him, the Brovars were falling, hard. Then the last one standing, Corga, roared and activated his armor. Plates unfolded across his body, glowing red, bristling with blades and cannons. He stomped toward Joe, who hadn't moved from his spot behind the bar. You think you're tough, human? Corga spat. You're just an old man in a cheap bar. Joe cracked his neck, put down his glass, and leaned in. You're right, he said, smiling for the first time in 20 years. But this cheap bar used to be a kill box for war criminals. And guess who trained it? Corga blinked. Joe locked eyes with him. Then everything went dark. The emergency lights flickered to life, bathing the bar in pulses of red. Shadows stretched across broken tables and smoldering wreckage. A low hum echoed through the steel bones of the rusty comet as backup generators kicked in. Corga stood in the dark, breathing heavy, blades humming softly on his powered armor. Joe was gone. The bar was silent, but the tension hung thick in the air, buzzing like static before a storm. One of the Brovar warriors groaned on the floor, trying to crawl. Another was wedged halfway into a dartboard, unconscious, twitching every time a loose wire sparked nearby. Corga stepped forward, slowly, turning in a full circle. Coward! He growled. Hide in the dark. Is that what humans do now? His voice echoed off the walls, unanswered. Behind the bar, bottles flickered in the emergency glow, casting warped reflections across the cracked mirror. Then a voice, low and bone-dry, came through the speaker system. Wasn't always like this. We used to charge head-on. Get medals. Parades. Then we learned that sometimes, shadows are smarter. Corga growled and turned, aiming his gauntlet cannon at the speaker. A plasma shot lit up the corner booth, blowing it apart. A spray of sparks rained down. No, Joe. Meanwhile, below the bar, deep beneath the floor where customers never wandered, Lady Vex moved through the hidden tunnels like she belonged there. Because, once upon a time, she had. Her fingers danced across control panels, swiping old codes and overriding backup security locks. The hallways were tight, lined with rusting war tech and sealed lockers that hadn't been touched in decades. She knew this place. Knew it better than she'd let on. And the further she went, the more memories pressed in, memories she didn't want, of a childhood spent in bunkers, learning to build bombs before she could spell her own name. She reached the old war room and stood in silence, staring at the dusty insignia on the wall. The Ghost Division. Her father's legacy. And hers, whether she liked it or not. She wiped a sleeve across the dusty interface and booted it up. The main display flickered, showing live feeds from above. Brovar warriors sprawled across the bar, Corga pacing like a lion ready to pounce, and no sign of Joe. Not yet. Vex opened a secondary window and started running data pulls. Her mission hadn't changed. Get the proof. Upload it to the tribunal. Make the deal. They promised to erase her record, wipe the bounty, give her a new name and a new life. All she had to do was betray her father. Again. Upstairs, Corga kicked over a table, frustrated. You hide like prey, he roared. Face me like a soldier. Behind the bar, a trapdoor opened. Joe emerged quietly, dragging a large case behind him. He was different now. No longer the hunched bartender in a stained apron. He wore a battered vest with a faded Ghost Division patch, and his eyes, though older, burned with the sharpness of a man who had seen too much. That's the problem, Joe muttered, setting the case on the bar. I was a soldier. Now I'm just tired. Corga charged, and Joe didn't flinch. He popped open the case, revealing a foldable pulse rifle fused with a bottle opener. As Corga leapt into the air, roaring, Joe pulled the trigger. The rifle fired a single pulse that hit Corga square in the chest, not to kill, but to disrupt. The armor froze mid-jump. Corga hit the ground like a dropped fridge. Joe walked around the bar, rifle still smoking. You ever clean that armor? He asked casually. Smells like wet fungus and cheap regrets. Corga roared, tried to rise, but his systems were still rebooting. Joe stood over him. I told you to leave. Corga spat at his feet. You killed my father. Joe paused. The room seemed to inhale with him. No, he said quietly. I spared him. Your father was a warlord. We took him down, yes. But I offered him surrender. He chose death. Corga stared at him, confusion flickering in his eyes. You lie. Joe stepped back, lowering the rifle. Check the archives. Ghost Division logged every mission. But they don't want you to see that, do they? Too inconvenient for their story. Corga gritted his teeth, fury battling doubt. Below, in the war room, Vex found the files. Thousands of them. Classified ops, secret raids, black site experiments. But one folder stood out, Operation Emberglass. She opened it, her breath catching. Footage filled the screen. The Brar warlord, Corga's father, surrendering. Pleading even. Then a beam strike from his own side. The Ghost Division had offered peace. The Brar Council had refused it, and erased the truth. Vex stared, fingers trembling. The tribunal hadn't wanted justice. They wanted Joe because he knew too much. She didn't hesitate. She yanked the drive from the console and ran. Back upstairs, Corga managed to rise. Joe stood with his arms crossed, tired but unafraid. You think I locked those doors to kill you? Joe said. I locked them so you'd listen. But you came in here looking for revenge, not truth. Corga's voice cracked. Then give me a reason not to finish what he started. Joe looked around at the wrecked bar, the unconscious warriors, the broken lights and silent jukebox. Because I'm not your enemy. I'm just the guy who kept the lights on long enough for you to see in the dark. A crash came from the side entrance as Vex burst through, holding the drive. She looked at Corga, then at Joe. You need to see this, she said, her voice tight. She tossed the drive onto the counter and activated the projection. Holograms lit the bar, documents, footage, transcripts, all streaming in the air. Corga stared at his father's image. At the betrayal. At the moment of truth he'd never known. His breath caught, his fists trembling. They lied? He whispered. Joe nodded. They always do. Vex turned to him. We have to go. This changes everything. The tribunal will send hunters. You're not safe. Joe sighed. Kid, I haven't been safe since I learned to shoot sideways. She shook her head. No jokes, not now. I sold them out. I gave them your location before I knew. They'll come for both of us. Joe looked at her for a long time, then gave the smallest smile. You're still terrible at betrayals. But you get points for style. Corga stepped back, his armor dimming. The fury had drained from him, replaced by a haunted stillness. I need to tell my people, he said. They have to know what really happened. Joe walked past him, heading toward the storage hatch. You do that, he said. But take your boys and get out before the tribunal does show up. This bar's not going to be standing by the end of the night. Vex followed him, voice low. You have a plan? Joe cracked his neck, opening a dusty crate filled with fusion cores. Nope. I've got explosives. Corga looked at them both, then slowly nodded. He turned, gathered his fallen clan, and limped out into the night. Behind them, the bar hummed, ticking like a bomb waiting for permission. Joe stared after them, then turned to Vex. You ready to burn the past down? She swallowed, staring at the holograms still flickering in the air. Only if we make sure someone sees the flames. Joe grinned. That's my girl. The bar was quiet again, but it wasn't peace. It was the hush that comes before everything goes straight to hell. The Brovar clan had limped off into the darkness outside, burdened with more than just bruises. They carried the truth now, raw and sharp, a story that would crack their world open if they dared speak it aloud. Inside, the rusty comet was more wreckage than refuge. Tables were overturned, scorch marks clawed the walls, and the air smelled like old whiskey and melted power coils. Joe stood in the middle of it all, looking around like a man surveying the wreckage of his own soul. Vex crouched by a console behind the bar, sweat running down her temple as she tried to bypass the last set of lockdown codes. Joe was already strapping on a lightweight armor vest, buckling it without urgency, like a man getting dressed for a funeral he'd seen coming years ago. He reached for the crate of fusion cores, slid it open, and began arranging them with the kind of practiced, terrifying calm that suggested this wasn't the first time he'd booby-trapped a building to buy himself some time. Vex looked over, alarm clear in her eyes. You're really going to blow the place? Joe didn't look up. This bar's seen better days. And besides, if they're sending tribunal hunters, they won't come asking nicely. I'd rather serve them one last drink, hot. A soft clank echoed from above. Vex froze. Joe did too. They both turned their heads toward the ceiling vents. Another clank, then a slow hiss. Joe's eyes narrowed. They're early. The sound of boots on metal followed, soft but fast, too fast. Not Brovar warriors, not bounty hunters. These were professionals. Tribunal black entry units. No insignia, no names, just armored ghosts dropped from orbit with orders to erase anything inconvenient. Joe reached under the counter and flipped the emergency override. The lights flickered again, this time shifting to a low, pulsing green. The remaining traps activated silently, blending in with the debris like forgotten furniture. Vex crouched behind the bar, pulling a modified pistol from her hip. Her voice was tight. You said you didn't have a plan? Joe crouched beside her, holding a glowing detonator. I don't. I have an idea. Ideas are like plans, but less polite. The first hunter dropped into the bar from a ceiling hatch, silent and sleek, scanning the room with infrared. Joe remained perfectly still, breathing slow, counting seconds. The second came through the side door, stepping over debris like a machine. They were coordinated, methodical. One more came in through the broken kitchen entrance, sweeping with a phase disruptor. Vex's heart pounded. Joe's hand hovered over the detonator, but he didn't press it. Not yet. The first hunter reached the center of the room and stepped directly onto a pressure pad disguised as a scorch mark. The trap activated with a low click. In a split second, the floor beneath the hunter erupted, launching the attacker into the ceiling with bone-crunching force before slamming him down again in a heap of broken armor. The other two reacted instantly, pivoting, firing toward the bar. Joe shoved Vex behind a steel column as plasma rounds slammed into the counter, blasting bottles and splintering the wood. He ducked, tossed a metal shaker into the air, and shot it mid-arc. The explosion sent a wave of shrapnel into the nearest hunter, sending him sprawling. Vex peeked out and fired, nailing the last one in the leg. It wasn't fatal, but it dropped him. Joe was already moving, rifle slung low, clearing the room with brutal efficiency. When the smoke settled, 3 hunters were down, 2 alive and groaning, 1 motionless. Joe didn't smile. He just walked over, grabbed a sidearm from the nearest body, and checked the charge. Scouts, he muttered. Which means the rest are coming. Vex slid back into cover, panting. How many more? Joe shrugged. However many it takes to shut me up for good. Back underground, more movement. The sensors triggered. Joe pulled up a screen and saw 6 more heat signatures moving through the tunnel system. They weren't taking chances. They were coming through every entrance at once. Joe looked at the fusion cores, looked at Vex, and made a choice. I'll hold them here, he said. You take the drive, get to the relay tower, and broadcast the files. If they can't silence the truth, it won't matter if they kill me. Vex grabbed his arm. No. We go together. Joe looked at her, a flicker of warmth breaking through the steel. You're fast. I'm stubborn. You'll make it. I probably won't. She shook her head, eyes burning. You're not doing this again. You left me once. You don't get to do it twice. He paused, jaw tight. You were a kid. I thought it was the only way to keep you safe. Vex's voice dropped. I didn't want safe. I wanted a father. The silence between them hurt more than the gunfire. Finally, Joe nodded once. Then let's raise some hell. Together they moved. Joe planted charges at the key points, entrances, supply crates, power nodes, while Vex uploaded the broadcast sequence into her comms rig. They knew they had minutes at most. The next wave hit hard. Explosives rocked the back wall as tribunal enforcers stormed in. Joe fired from behind an upturned table, covering Vex as she scrambled to the relay hub. A round clipped his shoulder, but he didn't slow. One hunter got too close. Joe slammed a barstool leg into his helmet, then shot him point-blank through the visor. Vex reached the console and slammed the drive into the uplink. The files began to transmit, thousands of them, pouring into public networks, news streams, pirate relays. She watched as red, access granted symbols lit up. The truth was out. It couldn't be stopped now. Behind her, Joe was a wall of resistance, reloading on instinct, bleeding, laughing like a man who finally remembered what it felt like to be alive. Then the ceiling caved in. A final wave of tribunal elites dropped through the roof, weapons primed. Joe turned, firing, yelling for Vex to run. She hesitated, caught in the moment. A hunter raised his weapon, and Joe threw himself in the way. The blast hit him full in the chest. He dropped. Vex screamed and fired until her weapon overheated. She ran to him, skidding to her knees. His eyes were still open. Barely. Blood bubbled at the corner of his mouth. Told you, stubborn, he rasped. You get the word out? She nodded, sobbing. Yes. They saw everything. Joe smiled weakly. Good. Then it was worth it. Outside, sirens wailed. Pirate broadcasts buzzed with breaking news. Across the galaxy, people were watching the truth unfold in real time. The tribunal's secrets were out. Their enforcers would come for her next. But now she had a choice. She stood, looking at the wreckage, at the old man who had given everything one last time. Then she picked up his rifle, slung it over her shoulder, and walked out through the smoke and fire. Behind her, the rusty comet burned like a star collapsing, violent, bright, unforgettable. The sun was rising over Dregner 9, or at least the faint amber glow that passed for dawn on this half-dead moon. Dust swirled lazily through the air, and distant sirens still echoed across the ridges, reminders that the galaxy had just shifted. Vex stood at the edge of the crater where the rusty comet had once been. All that remained was twisted metal, scorched earth, and a burnt bar sign half buried in rubble. She didn't cry. She'd done that already. Instead, she stood still, the wind tugging at her coat, watching the flames smolder and curl into the sky like ghosts of a story that had finally been told. They had tried to cover it up, of course. The tribunal scrambled fast, sending statements, planting counter-narratives, dismissing the files as fakes. But it was too late. The truth was everywhere now. Every planet, every system with a signal, had seen the footage. Had watched an old man and a haunted woman stand against a war machine and tell the galaxy what no one else dared. And the most surprising part? People believed it. Maybe it was the way he died. Maybe it was the footage itself. Or maybe it was just time. Time for the lies to fall and something real to rise from the ashes. Behind her, footsteps crunched over the gravel. Vex didn't turn. She already knew who it was. Corga stepped beside her, his armor scorched, his face older than it had been the day before. He hadn't shaved the burned half of his beard, letting it grow wild like a badge of shame and survival. He said nothing for a long while, just stood with her, staring at the crater where a bar once stood, and where his vengeance had died. Eventually he spoke, voice low and strange without the usual growl. "We took your story back to the council. They didn't want to hear it. Said it was propaganda. Said my father was a hero." Vex glanced at him. "What did you say?" He turned his eyes toward her, and for the first time, she saw something close to grief. "I said a hero doesn't shoot his own men to keep a war going. I said we don't get to rewrite history just because it makes us feel better." He looked back at the wreckage. "I don't think they'll let me come back." She nodded slowly. "Welcome to the club." Silence fell between them again, but it wasn't heavy. It was the kind of silence that follows understanding. Corga pulled something from his belt and held it out. A data shard. Vex took it, inspecting it with a frown. "What's this?" Corga looked off toward the distant hills. "Everything I could find. Tribunal comms. Orders. More proof. If they want war, we give them information. Make their truths small under the weight of ours." She pocketed it. "You're not bad at this rebellion thing." He smirked faintly. "I had a good teacher." The words hit her harder than she expected. She looked away before he could see the flicker in her eyes. The transport arrived 2 hours later, a rusted freighter piloted by a retired smuggler who owed Joe a favor from a lifetime ago. Vex climbed aboard with nothing but her coat, the rifle on her back, and a satchel full of data that could shatter empires. Corga stayed behind. His path was different now, a warrior without a war, a prince without a throne. He would return to his people, not with rage but with truth. That, Joe had said, was the real fight. And sometimes the hardest one. As the freighter rose into the sky, Vex looked down one last time. She could still see the shape of the rusty comet in her mind, dim lights, the hum of old music, the sound of Joe cleaning glasses while pretending not to care. She thought of how he'd looked at her that last time. No grand speeches. No apologies. Just a tired man giving her the only thing he had left, a chance. The stars opened up before her as they jumped to light speed. She didn't know where she was going. Maybe nowhere. Maybe everywhere. But she knew what she had to do. Broadcast the rest. Build the network. Find others like her, like Joe. People tired of being lied to, used, forgotten. People who remembered that truth could be a weapon, just as deadly as any gun. That was the mission now. Not revenge. Not rebellion for its own sake. But something bigger. Weeks passed. Then months. Across fringe worlds and forgotten colonies, whispers spread. A signal. A story. A face. Not Joe's, but hers. Vex became the ghost they couldn't catch. The one who walked through fire and came out carrying the truth. They tried to spin her into a terrorist, a traitor, a myth. But it didn't work. Because with every system she reached, another story surfaced. Another soldier who remembered what the Ghost Division had done. Another civilian who had lost someone to the tribunal's version of justice. And slowly, quietly, something began to rise from the cracks. Not a rebellion. Not yet. But a refusal. A refusal to forget. One night, on a cold mining moon orbiting a red giant, Vex stepped into a shabby dive bar much like the rusty comet used to be. The bartender, a cyborg missing half his jaw, didn't look up when she walked in. She sat at the counter, ordered something foul and burning, and waited. Eventually, someone slid into the seat beside her. A young girl with wide eyes and a battered transmitter hanging from her neck. She looked scared but hopeful. "Are you the one from the signal?" she whispered. Vex didn't answer. Just pushed a small device toward her. "Your turn now." And like that, it continued. Far away, deep in the tribunal core systems, the highest-ranking officials watched the spread of the network with growing dread. Every attempt to shut it down failed. Every bounty went unclaimed. The woman with the fire in her eyes and the old man's rifle on her back had become a symbol. And symbols couldn't be killed. Somewhere, on a ship with no name and a signal that bounced between asteroids, Vex stared out at the stars. Her fingers rested on the rifle, worn but still functional. She thought of Joe often, especially in the quiet moments. The way he laughed like it hurt, the way he held the world at arm's length, the way he had let her go and still found a way to fight beside her. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a legend. He was just a tired man who knew one truth. If someone pushes you hard enough, locking the doors is the only way to get them to listen. She smiled at that. Because they were listening now. The silence in the cockpit was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of the ship's core reactor and the occasional flick of buttons as Vex adjusted the signal relay. The stars stretched ahead, endless, a cascade of light painted on black canvas. She had been traveling for days, maybe weeks. Time felt like vapor now, bending and slipping away the faster she moved. The mission had changed, but not the fire inside her. The truth was out there, alive, multiplying. But so were the lies. The tribunal wasn't just losing ground, they were mutating, adapting. New faces. New tools. Same old agenda. And they'd started to get smarter. Smarter and meaner. She had intercepted a burst transmission from a forgotten penal colony just beyond the fringe line, a place that wasn't supposed to exist, but of course it did. According to the transmission, they were taking people, former soldiers, whistleblowers, journalists, and erasing them without trial. No records. No returns. Ghosts made real. The colony was officially listed as decommissioned. No traffic. No supplies. But someone had gotten a message out, shaky and broken, pleading. That was enough for Vex. The ship, an old, patched-up freighter named the Hollow Echo, groaned as it dropped out of light speed. The penal colony floated ahead like a rusted coffin, half-shrouded in debris, lights barely functional. It looked abandoned, dead in the water. But the sensor data told a different story. Movement inside, energy signatures, heat from deep within. Vex didn't wait for an invitation. She landed in one of the forgotten hangars, stepping out into stale air and immediate tension. Her boots echoed through the empty corridor, gun drawn, eyes sharp. She didn't expect a welcoming party, and she didn't get one. But what she found chilled her. The colony wasn't abandoned. It was operational, just hidden. The cells were full. Dozens of prisoners locked away, some unconscious, some staring blankly at walls, others pressing their faces to the glass with haunted eyes. She walked past them slowly, one hand brushing the bars. They didn't speak. Maybe they couldn't. Maybe they didn't believe she was real. She reached the central command deck and found the truth waiting. Surveillance logs. Torture files. Experiment notes. The tribunal hadn't just been imprisoning dissenters. They were studying them, breaking them, testing mind suppression techniques and neural inhibitors. And they were using Joe's name. Over and over again. Trying to replicate what he had done with the Rusty Comet. Trying to create artificial loyalty, programmable resistance. They hadn't erased him. They were trying to manufacture him. The realization hit her like a knife. She copied everything. Every log, every video, every whisper of what they were building. And then, without hesitation, she set charges in the command room. The explosion rocked the colony core, disabling power and opening emergency release locks on the cell blocks. The prisoners blinked into freedom as alarms screamed through the corridors. She didn't give a speech. She just shouted one word as she ran, out. And they followed. Some stumbled. Some crawled. Some ran like they were afraid they'd wake up and find it wasn't real. Vex led them to the hangar and loaded them onto the Echo, jamming override codes into the console until the ship's cargo bay opened with a sigh. They packed in, silent and confused, but alive. Vex hit the launch key and didn't look back. The colony vanished behind them, just another scar floating in the dark. In the days that followed, the story spread faster than any before it. Not just of the rescue, but of what the tribunal had tried to do. They weren't just fighting to silence truth. They were trying to rewrite the minds of those who held it. That revelation lit a fire across the systems. Outposts went dark. Officers defected. Whole units of tribunal enforcers vanished, some joining the growing resistance, others disappearing without trace. The name Vex became more than a signal. It became a promise. If she came for you, you had a chance. If she called for you, you answered. But not all of them were grateful. At a stopover station orbiting Helix 7, Vex met with a contact, someone who claimed to be a surviving member of the Ghost Division. He was older, lean, eyes like old stone. Called himself Riggs. He didn't waste time. Said he'd been watching her, watching the network, and he wasn't impressed. Said Joe would have done it differently. Said truth didn't win wars, power did. She listened. Let him rant. And when he was done, she stood and told him that power without truth was exactly how they'd ended up here in the first place. He tried to draw on her. She shot him first. The darkness was still everywhere, growing quieter, more subtle, but deeper. They weren't losing. They were evolving. Vex knew it. Felt it in the silence between battles. The tribunal wasn't interested in just crushing her. They wanted to erase the idea of her. Turn her into a villain. A cautionary tale. They started broadcasting false images, manipulated voice samples, fake war crimes. It worked on some. Systems turned their back on her. Bounties returned. Shadows stretched. She almost gave up. She sat one night in the Echo's cargo bay, surrounded by sleeping refugees. The weight of it all pressed down on her, heavy, suffocating. She stared at the rifle leaning against the wall. Joe's rifle. Her fingers traced the edge of the grip, worn smooth. She thought of how he smiled when everything was on fire, how he never once asked to be saved, just to be understood. She thought of the people they'd helped, the sparks they'd lit. She closed her eyes and said his name out loud for the first time in weeks. Just once. The next morning, a message came through. Not from a planet, not from an outpost. From a fleet. A full rogue fleet, deserters, pirates, exiles, all flying under one banner. No government. No council. Just an idea. If the tribunal could make an empire from fear, they could make one from truth. They asked for her help. Not to lead, but to fight beside them. They said her fire lit theirs. She smiled. It wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The hollow echo turned toward the signal, engines roaring, stars streaking past the hull. Vex stood at the front of the ship, rifle slung, coat billowing, fire in her eyes. She didn't want glory. Didn't want revenge. She wanted a galaxy where no one had to lock the doors just to be heard. And this time, she wouldn't be alone.